The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, my name is Gabe Howard and welcome to the monthly Psych Central webinar series. We're very excited to be here. We just have a couple of housekeeping items. Remember, we cannot see or hear you, so when you have questions, you may ask them during the presentation. Just go ahead and type them in whenever. However, I will be moderating the question and answer at the end of the presentation. So once you type it in, it will still be the end before it gets answered. But please don't be afraid to type them in during so that you don't forget and we can get all of our questions answered. And without further ado, we present the grass is greener syndrome. Nathan, I would like to hand it over to you.
All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me here tonight. Welcome to the Grass is Greener Syndrome webinar. I hope you enjoy this presentation. I've really tried my best to make this incredibly complicated and messy topic as organized and understandable as possible. So my name is Nathan Filas. I'm a psychotherapist in New York City, and I also do online coaching, working with people all around the world on Grass is Greener syndrome, as well as a few other specialties I help people with in my practice. So you can feel free to visit my website if you'd like to learn more about my work. And I'll put this slide up again at the end of the presentation if you'd like to take down any of the info here. But we have a lot to get into, so let's go ahead and start right in. So what is Grass is Greener syndrome? Internally first. So Grass is Greener syndrome is an emotional tug of war inside. It feels like there's something else that you're missing out on that might be more fulfilling. In some senses, it's like a fear of missing out syndrome. The emotional need to have something that you don't have already is so strong that in order to soothe the feeling, which feels like a true need, that people often chase after the other object, thinking and believing that it's going to be the missing piece that completes what is missing from the current picture. So for example, my partner has several positive traits, but certain things are missing that I crave. Maybe I should leave my relationship and find someone else with those other traits. To the person with Grass is Greener syndrome, this is a very challenging dilemma. Even if the traits in the current partner are greatly desired as well, the impact of what they are missing actually holds stronger emotional weight internally and eventually becomes a full preoccupation. What is currently being fulfilled doesn't get nearly the attention as what is not being fulfilled. It feels like a starvation in these areas of need. So as I'm going to discuss, Grass is Greener syndrome is highly problematic, often resulting in repeated back and forth movement and changes, starting over in various significant ways in life, with the grass never being as green as hoped at the new stops. But rather than internalizing this for the future, the belief becomes that something more perfect and more ideal is out there and that they just haven't found it yet. So this ends up reinforcing the Grass is Greener process. With each change, the desired new objects eventually become normalized. There is a period of time where there is great satisfaction in gaining those missing pieces that you were craving. However, after a bit of time, the power of what is now missing from the new current picture again takes over, even if what's now missing is what the person actually had in the picture before the most recent change. So basically there's a new starvation of needs at that point. So for example, the person made that relationship change. They left their partner, they found someone new to satisfy the need for all those other traits, and then after some time, the previous relationship and all that came with it is again desired, or another new relationship is desired that basically in many ways reflects the previous relationship. So we'll discuss in a little bit why this tends to happen. So now what is Grass is Greener syndrome externally? On the outside, Grass is Greener syndrome shows up in various forms. Most commonly, it is seen with relationships. People who often find themselves wondering if there's a better partner out there that they're missing out on, including other exes or people they haven't met yet. While many people in relationship in relationships have these normal thoughts from time to time, people with grass is greener syndrome tend to experience a crisis in this area that actually leads to multiple breakups and starting over, always hoping to find a better relationship that they are supposed to be in. But generally, none of the relationships end up feeling good or satisfying enough when caught in the grasp of the grass is greener process. Grass is greener syndrome is also commonly acted out with respect to where people live, often bouncing around the map from home to home, looking for the next experience to correct the ills of the previous experience. This is different than someone who generally desires a life of living in different places and prioritizes the desire to experience different ways of living and various qualities of life. Grass is greener syndrome in this area is often experienced as a need for the next place to be the right place to settle. But inevitably, with each move comes the feeling that either a previous place was better and that they should go back, or that the next new place will resolve the issues. Again, trying to find that best or most complete and fulfilling one, they can't quite find it. Career is another common externalization of grass is greener syndrome. People who constantly question if the career that they're in is the right one or if they should switch to something that seems like it would be more fulfilling. Many people find themselves switching from one career to the next repeatedly, sometimes going back to old careers and sometimes finding new lines of work, each time hoping the next stop will be the right fit. The words right or best or perfect come up a lot in grass is greener syndrome. So grass is greener syndrome can also present in various smaller but similar ways. For example, you're watching a TV show that may interest you, but constantly scrolling to see if there's something else that you'd rather be watching instead, or listening to a song while searching to see if there's another song that you'd rather be listening to, or eating a meal at a restaurant and wondering if you should have ordered that other meal or gone to that other restaurant that you were considering. The list really goes on, but the overall psychological, emotional, and relational processes are basically the same. You have one thing in front of you that may actually, in many ways, be good enough, but your eye is constantly looking for the better, more perfect, and more fulfilling replacement. Each change starts strong, feeling fulfilled, passionate, and happy with the change. But then as time goes by, the passion starts to dissipate. And there's a feeling of distance, maybe even boredom in the current situation, which leads to searching outside the relationship, career, or otherwise to find the missing pieces that will hopefully bring the return of those positive and passionate feelings again, and rinse and repeat. So before moving forward, just so you understand what to expect from this presentation, you're not suddenly going to walk away feeling like your grass is greener process is changed or suddenly resolved. So that wouldn't be realistic. However, I hope you'll come away from this understanding some of the complexity of what's going on behind the scenes in this kind of process. Have a sense of at least some piece of what may resonate with your own situation, and gain some awareness about steps that can help resolve current and future grass is greener life crises. With grass is greener syndrome, there's generally the current crisis, and then how to manage or prevent similar future crises that need to be attended to. So how does someone end up with grass is greener processes? First, on the most basic level, struggles with commitment and with decision making tend to be the significant hallmarks of grass is greener syndrome. However, it goes even deeper than this into struggles with intimacy, fear of settling for less than you believe that you should have, focusing on what you don't have, or fear of boredom and loss of passion. The basic underlying feeling is that new is exciting and covers all of these bases. Newness renews a brief sense of intimacy and gratifies the emotional need where it was missing, making you feel like you're getting what you want and not settling for less. In fact, settling down in any area feels mundane, routine, unexciting, and leaves a void. The new brings out the aforementioned feelings of passion Whereas in settling, the passion dissipates over time, leading a person to feel like this is it, this is all there is. So the grass is greener thinker tends to think that the right environment will keep all of these bases covered, and that there won't be a time, or there won't be much time, where things dissipate if you're in the right situation. So in order to understand more about how grass is greener patterns develop, we first need to address the issue of projection. Now, to briefly describe what projection is a defense mechanism that occurs unconsciously when we aren't able to consciously own a piece of ourselves. We locate these parts of ourselves in other people so we don't have to face these pieces of ourselves. For example, we may not want to acknowledge the parts of ourselves that can sometimes be selfish. So on a deeper subconscious level, we avoid acknowledging that we can be selfish at times and instead get incredibly frustrated when we believe we experience someone else being selfish. It's easier to point to someone else as selfish than to acknowledge our own areas of selfishness. So this is one example of how projection works. But any element of ourselves can be projected if it is too threatening for our ego to own. So to bring this into grass is greener terms now, grass is greener syndrome tends to be a huge projection. It generally tends to be a projection of the unconscious need to find perfection in ourselves. And unable to find perfection in ourselves, we instead project it outward. And this is basically an externalized acting out of our own striving for perfection. And since we as human beings can't be perfect, perfectionism is like fighting a battle that you can never quite win. So this is what happens in grass is greener syndrome. There is an illusion that you can find that perfection. It becomes so threatening to one's ego to accept the parts of ourselves that are in process and not perfect, that these parts end up projected outwardly into the world. The battle becomes an attempt to perfect the environment around you, unconsciously hoping that it'll bring an internal sense of being settled and satisfied. However, what ends up happening is a very all or nothing black and white process. Internally and externally, you're either perfect or you're not good enough. And this need for perfection, combined with the fear of failure, becomes lived in the world as the grass is greener syndrome. However, the changes that occur in the grass is greener process don't tend to provide that hope for satisfaction and fulfillment, even if it may briefly early on. This is because the imperfections internally still remain in place, even if the external is satisfied for a period of time. So once the new and momentarily exciting changes starts to turn into a lesser green grass over time, the need for perfection is again projected outwardly and again starts to take over. So the projections also often include a sense of confusion of who a person feels they should be or are supposed to be, coming into conflict with who they actually want to be on a deeper level. In these cases, which is very common, people often unconsciously find themselves caught between meeting expectations from others in some way versus a more dedicated sense of self-actualization. And this is a common grass is greener setup. Essentially, if who you imagine yourself to be in your mind and who you may have grown up believing you were supposed to be isn't matching your emotional desires. So this ends up acted out by trying to fulfill that other piece of yourself or other pieces of yourself while simultaneously trying to hold on to the original piece. So this leads us nicely into the grass is greener paralysis. So going back to the difficulty with decision making for a moment, for some, it may be easy to make decisions in the workplace, but in their personal lives, it can be very difficult. There may have been unpleasant experiences with making decisions that have led to emotional pain, leaving the feeling that you can't trust yourself to make major decisions without choosing against your best interest. So now, when faced with major decisions, it becomes impossible to commit to a choice. without knowing what's really in your best interest and not wanting to face the pain of making the wrong decision, grass is greener processes can at times lead to paralysis in the midst of two different options, instead of actually the bouncing back and forth that tends to happen a lot. However, paralysis mode in grass is greener syndrome actually isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it tends to be a signal that a person is becoming more aware on some subconscious level of their grass is greener process, and in some ways may serve as a subconscious attempt to stop the cycle from repeating. So while this can be a step in a good direction for the grass is greener mind, what still often remains in grass is greener paralysis is this process of trying to figure out which side is right, rather than the integration of both sides. So grass is greener paralysis is still caught in the grass is greener process, even if it's not actively bouncing around. So going even deeper now, if this isn't already confusing enough, but people's history of painful life losses tends to work its way into the mix. With grass is greener syndrome, when faced with the decision of one option versus another, the fear of the pain of loss of either choice is so strong that once the mourning period of the rejected side sets in, it makes the avoidance of that pain come out through grass is greener patterns. Essentially, you start to experience the loss of the choice you rejected, and it hurts a lot, recalling previous losses and abandonment in your life. And because it hurts, it is taken as a sign for many that you really want to go back to that other side. This is a problematic train of thought, though, which really has you repeatedly running away from pain more than it has you going toward what may truly be best for you. So people with grass is greener syndrome also tend to experience a heavy grip of nostalgia. If they allow themselves to, they can be carried away into an elaborate fantasy, reliving the old euphoric images of the past, and as a result, end up striving to recreate that feeling in present life. The problem is that nostalgia is a feeling connected to the pain of loss. And while the hope is that these fantasies will become a reality, and that will bring a response of joy and happiness and satisfaction, it leads once again to chasing an image of perfection, which leads to dissatisfaction, disappointment, and again, feelings of loss. So it's a pretty vicious cycle. So why is grass is greener syndrome generally not so easy to treat and overcome? And I say generally not easy because it certainly is possible to overcome it. I've seen many people come through the other side of this issue. However, as you're seeing here, the grass is greener process is really a collection of issues happening all at once that the professional needs to thoroughly understand and know how to respond to. Otherwise, the person struggling with grass is greener syndrome will likely end up spinning themselves into circles while the professional helplessly observes it happening, uncertain of how to bring you out of it. So obstacle number one in trying to overcome this is that after identifying what the underlying causes of grass is greener syndrome are, part of what makes overcoming it challenging is the mindset itself. Because of the strength of the tug-of-war happening in your mental and emotional processes, it is very difficult to overcome grass is greener syndrome on your own without any help at all. It's a process that is stuck and often heavily reinforced over time. By the time the symptoms of grass is greener syndrome show up in the first place, a person is already pretty deeply entrenched in the psychological, emotional, and relational processes, which in itself creates a blind spot in terms of how to escape this issue without shifting the mechanism as a whole. So most people who contact me for help with grass is greener syndrome present experiencing significant amounts of anxiety and stress due to the strength of the internal conflict, which in and of itself makes it almost impossible to actually have a clear, sound, thought and decision-making process about what is actually best for yourself in that state of mind. Even if deciding, hey, I'm just going to choose one side and get out of this mess, while it may temporarily stop the external crisis, it doesn't tend to stop the grass is greener process from continuing internally, which will likely lead to another grass is greener crisis eventually. So the first thing that makes this issue tough to overcome is that many people try to figure it out on their own, and it's really hard to achieve the hoped for results this way. So obstacle number 2. Another issue that's problematic in the grass is greener process is the idea that you can actually complete your present life picture with the change to the other option. And what I mean by this is that everyone's emotional states are at a certain place based on a number of factors in your internal and external environments. Right now in your career, relationship, or city or town, surrounding friends, etc., your emotions are responding to what you are and what you aren't receiving, what is and what isn't being nurtured. So the fantasy with grass is greener syndrome is that the new situation is going to complete the picture and satisfy those needs that aren't currently being nurtured. The fantasy is that you will feel fulfilled, happy, satisfied, and complete when you make that change. But what people in grass is greener processes tend to overlook is that in order to experience the new environment, the total environment is going to change with that. Rather than simply adding the missing pieces to the picture, it's going to actually change the picture altogether. So with this, inevitably comes losing the pieces that you were unknowingly nurturing in the previous emotional environment. Therefore, you're not actually completing your present emotional environment as much as just making it different. And this, again, ends up reinforcing the grass is greener process. So obstacle number 3. What makes it additionally difficult is how deep the sense of loss, desire, and nostalgia is in the experience of the fantasies. The yearning for something in that ideal image. For most anyone, the desire for the new situation is actually often the repetition of something relationally and emotionally old and deep. So the fantasies promise to resolve the feelings of loss and imperfection. However, the realities never match the image in one's mind. You can't really go back to relive that memory in your head for real. So they come with their own current sets of complexities and are therefore almost inevitably disappointing, thus fueling another round of grass is greener acting out. So obstacle number 4. What also makes grass is greener syndrome difficult is that people often find themselves stuck between two various sets of conflicting feelings, and they don't know which side they should listen to. The reality is that generally both sides are relevant in some way, and the idea of having to shed one side versus the other is very difficult, if not painful. Grass is greener processes tend to be very black and white, but the internal split that's created in grass is greener syndrome puts the person in an impossible situation that can't really be resolved, trying to split off one side of themselves while fully taking the other side as the right option. So of course, what ends up happening is the starvation and loss of one side of yourself, which can't go on long without a problem. Hence the continuous process of going back and forth between the two sides. So when you find yourself thinking, which side? Well, the answer generally tends to sit somewhere between both, and also likely may include third, fourth, fifth, or even more options that you're actually unable to see at this point. So these are options that only begin to start presenting themselves when you're no longer in a this option versus that option mode. So how do you know that you're dealing with grass is greener syndrome versus actually making a positive decision for a healthy and beneficial life change? This is a very common and good question with respect to grass is greener patterns. And I've seen many people who find themselves caught ruminating over whether the decision is actually a good and positive change for their lives, or if they're perpetuating grass is greener patterns. There are many situations in life where a change can be a good, if not necessary, thing. And just because you make a major life change doesn't mean you're necessarily acting out grass is greener patterns. So there are two main things to pay attention to in order to help you understand where you fall in this area. First, the reasons for the change. Is your current situation causing you pain, abuse, or in some other way causing you hurt on a regular basis? Are very few of your needs being met in your current relationship or career or geographic living situation or otherwise? Is the desire for change an attempt at completing the picture or making it more perfect or trying to have it all? So that's the first one. The second one, is there a pattern to this behavior or thought process? Do you find yourself seeking changes repeatedly? Does this process tend to play out in more just this current situation? Of course, sometimes you may determine that the situation that you're in is actually good enough, but that you find that you'd be settling because your most primary needs are not actually being met. For example, a job or relationship that you can live with, but feel you're sacrificing too much of what you want. So maybe a change is good, but if it keeps happening from one situation to the next, then it's more likely that more is going on and possibly related to grass is greener processes. And it's, by the way, it's okay if you don't quite know the answers to these 2 points for yourself yet. These answers are not always clear or accessible without taking the time to look more deeply and reflectively into oneself. So if you don't know the answers to these at this point, that's okay. So what helps to manage and overcome grass is greener syndrome? Again, I can't encourage enough to seek help to get past this issue. But once you've sought help with everything we discussed so far as a backdrop to grass is greener syndrome, here are some of the areas where I focus with people as part of the overall process of overcoming this issue. So the first one, as you see, is managing internal expectations and setting realistic expectations. Not relying on repetitions of external shifts to create internal fulfillment. So basically focusing on repairing the internal processes. Learning how to cope with not having it all, compromise, desires versus needs, integration of needs, and learning how to determine for oneself what is needed to feel satisfied and fulfilled without always needing more than you have. Managing emotions of grief and mourning and yearning in the grass is greener process. For example, feeling nostalgia and pain of loss of a previous time of life or a relationship, or coming to understand on a deeper level that yearning for something old and or new doesn't necessarily need to bring your current situation into question. Differentiating between fantasy and reality, where they meet and where they split. Understanding situations as different and not necessarily relative to each other. Creating balance, developing a tolerance for middle ground, as grass is greener syndrome is often driven by black and white processes, which keeps putting people back on two separate ends of the spectrum as opposed to finding a way of being balanced with pieces of both sides, sort of both in the picture. So these are just some of the areas that are looked at as part of overcoming the greater grass is greener process, as each of these points tends to serve a role in reinforcing grass is greener syndrome. So I hope that this presentation has given some insight into the complexity of grass is greener syndrome and some of the obstacles that people can run into while trying to push past it, and why it can wreak such havoc in your life. If there are two things that I really hope you take with you from this presentation, I know this was very complex and there are a lot of parts to this, But it's not necessary to remember every piece of this. But if there are two things I hope you take with you, it's to not be afraid of getting help and to know that grass is greener syndrome is really possible to overcome and more effectively manage if it does show up in the future. I've seen many people do it, and though it's a complicated issue, it is really not hopeless, even if at times the experience of being stuck in this repetitive and defeating process may feel at times hopeless. So thank you for listening to this presentation and all of its complexity, and I'm happy to take a few questions if there are any.
Wonderful, thank you so much. While everybody is typing in their questions, I have one of my own. One of the parts that was very interesting to me is you said flipping through television channels and this fear of missing out on a better television show. I don't really do that because I'm a DVR person, and I thought, oh, I don't do that. And then you followed it up with constantly changing the car channels. Like many people, I have my car hooked up to my Bluetooth, which gives me an unlimited number of songs. And I don't know that I've ever finished a song in the last 6 months. I get about halfway through and I continue to the next one because a better song is out there.
Yeah, and it's not to say that for sure it means there's grass is greener syndrome, but there is this sort of fear of missing out that comes along with grass is greener syndrome, and it tends to be prevalent in various smaller and bigger ways. And sometimes, if a person is lucky, the grass is greener feelings or the fear of missing out feelings never quite manifest into the uncertainty with the relationship or with the career, those bigger parts of life in some way. And if they just stick to the smaller things, then that's great. But when those smaller things are present, the potential for the bigger things can be there, and it can be reflective of something else kind of brewing underneath. But it doesn't always mean it's there. That's the bright side of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. The first question that we have is, would you say that grass is greener syndrome and anxiety disorders have a lot in common? Are they related?
That's a very good question. I think that many people that I've worked with grass is greener syndrome, anxiety is a big part of it. I hesitate to say that there's always going to be an anxiety, sort of a general anxiety with grass is greener syndrome. It's kind of the chicken or the egg thing. When you're sitting in a place where you're feeling so much uncertainty, are you experiencing anxiety because there's so much uncertainty, or is it the other way around? But the stress of grass is greener syndrome tends to bring up a lot of different emotions, and anxiety tends to be one of those experienced very heavily. So I would venture to imagine, and I haven't thought of it from this actual perspective, so it's a very good question, but I would venture to imagine that they're in some ways related, that there is constantly a need to figure out something else that might be better, that's kind of an internal anxiety in some ways in and of itself. So I would say there's probably a correlation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. The next question is, do you feel that mindfulness can help when dealing with grass is greener syndrome?
Mindfulness is a good technique. It can help with a lot of things. With grass is greener syndrome, it's I think it can be a good coping mechanism. And when I say that, I think it can help somebody in a moment where maybe they're having a momentary feeling of, am I in the right place? And sort of feeling ungrounded and needing to find a way through that emotional sort of moment or emotional crisis. So mindfulness can be good for that. I would say that really addressing the mechanism itself, the grass is greener process, is probably overall more necessary because mindfulness doesn't tend to address the underlying issues that are happening, that are creating this problematic environment internally and externally. So what I think it can do is help a person cope through a bad moment. But if the grass is greener feelings are really strong and are really playing out to a heavy degree, I would say that it's probably pretty difficult to rely fully on mindfulness to take care of it. But it doesn't mean it can't be helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. The next question is there, give me one moment, I apologize. Will medication help with grass is greener syndrome?
I'm just thinking back through my bank of work with this here, and I don't recall ever really noting an experience where someone took medication and suddenly their grass is greener feelings disappeared. What I have seen more is, going back to that anxiety question, that the anxiety is so heavy that, or even the depression that can be caused by being stuck in this constantly defeating process, that I've seen people take medication for these sort of feelings that come up relative to grass is greener syndrome. But it generally, from what I've seen, has not resolved the grass is greener process. It might have taken a little bit of the edge off of the amount of stress that comes along with it, but it hasn't seemed to answer the question. It hasn't made someone really say, now that I'm feeling less anxious, I think I'm going to go with this side, or I'm going to go with this side. Or those questions have still tended to remain, even if there's been a little bit of an edge taken off.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And then could tackling black and white thinking in therapy help resolve or alleviate grass is greener syndrome?
That is a very good thing to work on. I think that all of these components that were discussed here all have their significant relevance, but grass is greener syndrome in many ways is driven by black and white, and it's driven by nostalgia and driven by pain and all that. But there's the black and white process of it is so strong that it could only be, I would say, to one's advantage to really look into the black and white all or nothing process that is going on within you if you're aware of that happening, because that feeling that you have to end up on one side or the other, it is a big part of what reinforces grass is greener syndrome. So it could not hurt. I think it would only be beneficial to try to tackle that if you're wanting to go past this issue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I believe that we have reached the end of our questions. We'll give it another few seconds just in case somebody is typing there. But Nathan, thank you so much. Are there any last words that you have for us before we close?
Once again, I appreciate everyone listening to this, and I know it's quite complex, and I went over a lot of pieces to this. So, if there's ever, if this is something you feel you're experiencing and would like to reach out to me with questions or anything else, you're welcome to always send me an email. You see my information on the screen here, but I appreciate you having me, and thank you very much.
We're very glad to have you. Thank you, everybody, and Thank you, everybody, and this concludes this month's Psych Central webinar. Nathan, we thank you very much for being here, and we will see everybody next month.
Thank you.